Reverend Jay Wallen. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Quad Cities. Some new faces here who I don't know. Be sure to introduce yourselves to me downstairs after the talk. And we have some brownies and other cookies I saw. I may even slip out a little early to get one. No, anyway, we are honored tonight to have Michael Dowd here speaking. Michael has been a leader in the evolutionary spirituality movement. He and his wife Connie have been driving in their van, and they live in their van, and they travel cross-country for 12 years visiting different congregations. I love on their van it has the kissing fishes, and one of them says Jesus, the other one says Darwin, and they're kissing each other. And it's inspiring. And anyway, so they've been traveling around getting the message out about climate change and about evolutionary spirituality. And we're very honored that he's here tonight. They've given speeches at over 2,000 churches and other religious institutions and secular groups across all denominations. And always, I've heard it myself, it's probably the fourth time I'll hear him speak. Each time it's more inspiring than the last. His latest book, Thank God for Evolution, has been praised by 6 Nobel laureates, and it's a great book. If you haven't had a chance, you can get a copy of it. Michael gives this talk for free. That's how passionate he is about this, and so he supports his ministry of doing this by selling his books and DVDs. So I encourage you to browse and look and buy if you find it interesting. And without further ado, it's with great joy that I welcome Michael Dowd.
I'm absolutely delighted with the turnout. I would have been happy with half this number, so this is great. I'm curious, how many of you were not here on Sunday or who have never heard me speak? Wow, at least half of you, maybe more. Okay, great. Well, those of you that were here on Sunday, there will probably be several things that I'll say that I also shared on Sunday, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And if folks come in late, there's also some chairs here in the front, because as we all know, in churches, people don't sit on the front pew anyway. So the title of this program is called The Future is Calling Us to Greatness. And the reason that the lighting is the way that it is, I didn't want that bank of spotlights on because it washes out my screen. And my screen, you'll see, every one of my slides is drop dead gorgeous. Connie has been taking photos all over North America for the last 12 years. So every photo Connie has taken, other than the few that we got that, like from NASA, galaxy shots and things like that. The title is The Future is Calling Us to Greatness. And it's what this is about is right relationship to reality. And I'll be using the words God and reality interchangeably. Those of you on Sunday know why. Those of you that don't, I'll be making the case for why I think it's not only legitimate to do that, but why, for religious people, it may be necessary for our species to even survive into the future. So what does it mean to be in right relationship to reality in the 21st century and beyond? I did a TEDx talk just a couple of months ago back in Grand Rapids, Michigan, called Reality Reconciles Science and Religion. And all the content that I did there will also be in my program tonight. There's lots of different paths to right relationship to reality. There's no one way to live in right relationship to reality. The path that I'm particularly passionate about, I call the path of factual faith or sacred realism. I'm a religious naturalist. I don't have any supernatural or otherworldly beliefs at all. I have many close friends who do, but I don't. All of my religious feelings and experience I interpret in a naturalistic way. My great mentor, Thomas Berry, died just a few years ago at the age of 94. And this quote will help set the context for this evening's program. He said, "We're talking only to ourselves. We're not talking to the rivers. We're not listening to the wind and the climate. Most of the disasters that are happening now are a consequence of that spiritual autism." Now, just a little background. My wife, Connie Barlow, is a science writer. She's written 4 science books, From Gaia to Selfish Genes and Evolution Extended, are both MIT Press books. The Ghost of Evolution was Amazon.com's top recommended science book for 3 months when it came out in 2001. And Green Space, Green Time, The Way of Science, you could say the spirituality of science. This is one of the leading books in what's called religious naturalism. It was also featured on the cover of the national membership magazine of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UU World, back in 1997, before I ever met Connie. I'm married to somebody who's been on the cover of the UU World twice. I think that's fantastic. Now, my background is in ministry. I pastored 3 Christian churches over the course of a decade, although I did have 1 foot in the Unitarian Universalist Association during that whole time. I was a member of the Church of the Larger Fellowship. I've also done sustainability and transformational education, and have written 2 books, Earth Spirit back in 1990, which is on ecological Christianity, and my more recent book, Thank God for Evolution. And the content of tonight's program will be in the book that I'm working on now. Jay mentioned we've been living on the road for the last 12 years. And here you can see the side of our van. We've got the Jesus and Darwin fish kissing with hearts between them. Definitely gets us some interesting looks in conservative parts of the world like this. Got flipped off last time I was in Texas. But it's also gotten us some interesting press. The New York Times Magazine did a feature article on my book, and here I am on Fox and Friends on Sunday morning. Now, my mother, who only watches Fox News, happened to be watching this, which was pretty cool, right? And at the beginning, they were really skeptical. And after 5 minutes, they were like, well, thank God for evolution. That's a book whose time has come. This is Fox News. So I was pretty pleased. We've spoken to 2,000 groups over the last 12 years, and they break down into radically different populations. And I can do the exact same program in all these settings without changing a single slide. And I've done this many, many times. And we did surveys for 4 years. And I know from experience that about 90% of the people who come to either one of our programs love it. Because we ask them. Because what we focus on is the sacred side of science, the inspiring side of an evidential worldview that can enrich any religious tradition and secular orientations. The book I'm working on right now I'm calling Religion 3.0, and there's 2, I want to say commandments, but they're not commandments. They're 2 fundamental principles that align for tens of millions of us around the world. The need to live in right relationship to reality, whether we use secular or religious terms to talk about reality, and the need to co-create a just and healthy future. And I know this because I've spoken to groups across the theological spectrum, from theists to atheists. In fact, Connie and I had to create our own term as a bridge-building term. It can be pronounced creatheist or creatheist. Yeah. It's creativity is divine, basically. Naturalists and supernaturalists, as well as, obviously, skeptics, humanists, and freethinkers, and religious people, moderate to liberal religious people in almost every religion. And I find that encouraging, because we've got to find ways of cooperating across a vast swath of differences in order to ensure a healthy future. I love this photo. So, right relationship to reality is what has always mattered for all species. Any species that doesn't live in right relationship to reality goes extinct. And words create worlds. The word, because we live in a world created by symbolic language, our worldviews, how we experience reality, is largely shaped by the language that we use, and that language changes over the centuries. In other words, we use words today that didn't even exist 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. What we call reality, or nature, the ancients called God, or if you lived in a polytheistic culture, the gods. The word nature didn't exist for the Hebrews. The word reality didn't exist for the Hebrews. And we don't believe this to be true. We know this. The evidence is compelling. Whatever else it means to live in right relationship to reality, it's got to include living in right relationship with the air, the water, the soil, and the life of this planet. It's also got to include living in right relationship to future generations. Besides, I love showing off my granddaughter. So I dedicate this program to Isla Renee and to her grandchildren. Loyal Rue is a fellow Iowan. He lives, he's a retired professor up at Luther College in Decorah. And he's got a book called Religion is Not About God. What he means is that religion is about our relationship to reality. And yes, reality has been personified as the various gods and goddesses. But what religion is about is helping us live in the right relationship to what's inescapably real. I love this quote. He says, the most profound insight in the history of humanity is that we should seek to live in accord with reality. Indeed, living in harmony with reality may be accepted as a formal definition of wisdom. If we live at odds with reality, foolishly, then we will be doomed. But if we live in right relationship with reality, wisely, then we will be saved. Now he goes on to say that all cultures have had at least a tacit understanding of this truth. What we're less in agreement about is how we should think about reality and what we should do to put ourselves into harmony or alignment with it. But that makes total sense when you realize that these two fundamental questions that all cultures have needed to address, what's real, or how things are, and what's important, or which things matter, would have been answered differently at different times in history and different places around the world. I mean, it's like the 5 blind men and the elephant, the 5 blind women and the elephant. I mean, if you've got 5 blind people and they're each experiencing a different aspect of reality, a different aspect of the elephant, if these were 5 different theologians, you'd have 5 totally different theologies. And believe it or not, religious differences are not a lot more complex than that. I mean, reality 100,000 years ago in an African tribe in South Africa is very different than reality, say, 50,000 years ago in a tribe. Then you get a bunch of tribes interacting. They face some crisis, some challenge, some chaos. They figure out how to align the self-interest of each tribe with a new level of complexity, and a chiefdom or a kingdom emerges. Then you get a bunch of chiefdoms and kingdoms interacting. This is how the world has become as complex as it is, and chaos keeps driving this. Chaos is a good thing. And that's good, because we're not going to have any shortage of chaos in the coming decades. And all the world's religious traditions reflect regional collective intelligence around these questions. But what we now need isn't just tribal collective intelligence. We don't need just regional collective intelligence. We need our best global collective intelligence. That is our best globally produced answers to these questions. And that's what science is. You don't that's what science is. You don't understand science if you think it's just another language game. Science reflects humanity's global collective intelligence. You've got Christian scientists, Buddhist scientists, Hindu scientists, atheist scientists, scientists of all religious tradition and no religious tradition that are all contributing to our best understanding of how things are and which things matter, or what's real and what's important. Now, of course, this begs the question, what's religion? Is religion just supernatural otherworldlyism, as some of the new atheists critique? I suggest you no. Oh, by the way, this is me at the bottom of Deer Creek Falls in the Grand Canyon. This actually goes up 140 feet. Connie and I rafted for a week down the Colorado River with a bunch of geologists and science people. It was one of the highlights of our lives. But religions are mythic maps of what's real and what's important. And when I say mythic, I'm meaning that they use personification. That's how they have an I-thou personal relationship to nature. See, most of us have an I-it relationship, and there's a cost to that. I'll come back to that here in a few minutes. And religions also provide personal wholeness and social coherence. There's no religion in the world that doesn't consistently provide personal wholeness and social coherence by providing a mythic map of what's real and what's important. And all religions provide consistent, reliable access to the feeling states that humans have always needed to thrive. We simply can't thrive. We don't thrive as human beings if all we can do is look to the future with fear. We can only thrive if we can look to the future with trust, including trusting that we're going to die, that we won't be here forever. All religions, through different beliefs, get people to trust. The same thing, though. We can't thrive, we don't thrive as humans if all we can do is look to the past with resentment or guilt or bitterness. We can only thrive when we can look to the past with gratitude. In fact, now we even have secular ways. Therapy is in large part helping people to re-story, to reinterpret their past, to find something to be grateful for, where before all they had was resentment or bitterness or guilt. And, same thing, we don't thrive as humans if we're overwhelmed by the challenges of the day. As we all know, compost happens. Life just throws us a big pile of junk to deal with. So sometimes, So how do we stay inspired to be in action, whatever the challenges may be? Well, all religions have beliefs that get us to these fundamental feeling states. They have different beliefs, but their beliefs get people to these fundamental feeling states that humans have needed to thrive. We didn't have knowledge that could get us there until very recently. We now have knowledge that we can all agree on, but not in a way that disses religion, but in a way that helps the religious traditions themselves to evolve. This is vital. I did a program at a Christian church about 1.5 years ago, and this was a very liberal Christian church, and they were specifically wanting to know, is there a way of using God language that's totally accurate scientifically, or should we just sort of use other language? And you know that Tina Turner song, What's Love Got to Do with It? And so humor me here, I created my own version. What's God got to do with it? What's God but an ancient mythic notion? What's God got to do with it? Who needs Poseidon? Plate tectonics make the ocean. An old mentor of mine said, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. So that's what I want to talk about now, is a way to use God language. In fact, I think the only way to use God language that's completely accurate scientifically and also inspiring. Now, if you lived 500 years ago in the Pacific Northwest, I took this picture, or Connie took this picture in eastern Washington, and there was this humongous boulder that was almost the size of this church in the middle of a field with no other mountains anywhere nearby. How would you and your people, what would your culture, your tradition say about how this boulder got there? I mean, anything this weird or this interesting or this cool demands a story. So not having a story simply wasn't a possibility. My hunch is, God did it. Would have been the way most cultures would have talked about how that boulder got there. You know, or Great Spirit, or the goddess, or whatever. But some divine name, that's how it happened, would have been the way almost every culture would have talked about it. Well then, about 70 years ago, geologists such as J. Harlan Brett started noticing these interesting geological features in the Pacific Northwest. And now there's not a geologist in the world that would debate how that boulder got there. 17 times the glaciers have come south and the glaciers have gone back, just in the last 2.5 million years. 17 times. And when they came down, they blocked the Clark Fork River and created a dam, this lake, glacial Lake Missoula, that was almost as large as Lake Superior. And then it would fill up, and then it would break the ice dam, and within 48 hours, all this water would rush to the Pacific Ocean. And these icebergs would carry boulders and drop them along the way. It scoured this land here. It couldn't get out of the Willamette Valley, so it dropped a lot of silt, which is why that's such a fertile valley to this day. And it happened dozens of times. So, 500 years ago, how'd that boulder get there? God did it. 70 years ago, geologists started saying, no, God didn't do it. It happened through natural causes. And what we're now finally able to appreciate is these are different ways of saying essentially the same thing. The words God and evolution are both pointing to the same divine creative process. Both answer the question, how did we get here? How did everything get here? One uses the mythic or relational language of religion. The other uses literal or the empirical language of science. Arguing whether it was God or evolution that created everything is like debating whether it's Uncle Sam or the U.S. government that insists we pay taxes every year. Or like quarreling over whether it was Gaia or plate tectonics that created the oceans and the mountains. Such silly and largely unnecessary confusion will remain the norm until we get and celebrate personification. I would say that the most important religious revelation, if you want to use religious language, the most important religious revelation of the last 100 years is personification. That our brains inherently personify. That's what we do. We know of no culture that survived that hasn't done that. And if you want to use secular language, the most important scientific discovery about religion is the same thing. James Hillman, the great psychologist who died recently, or a few years ago, he said, loving is a way of knowing, and for love to know, it must personify. Personifying is thus the heart's mode of knowing. It's not a lesser, primitive way of apprehending, but a finer one. To enter myth, we must personify. And to personify carries us into myth. Now he's using the word myth not as an untrue story, but the way Joseph Campbell used the term, a narrative that puts us in accord with the nature of reality. Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian, said, I just recently reread this book last year, that there's a profound difference between an I-thou relationship to others and to nature and an I-it relationship that's all about using others or using nature for your benefit, but not honoring and respecting it as in its own right. And what he said basically is that we will not survive as a species if we continue to relate to nature as an it. And yet that's exactly what we've been doing. We've been thinking of nature as a complex clock. For 500 years, ever since we developed pendulum clocks, we started thinking of nature as a clock. And God became trivialized. God was no longer immanent and omnipresent. That is, there's no place that God stops and something else starts. God now is the clockmaker outside a clockwork universe. So God became only transcendent, and you can either believe in God or disbelieve in God. But both have a trivial concept of God. A God that's only outside nature. A God that's less than nature. Certainly less real than nature. Undeniably real. And the consequences have been tragic. Thomas Berry said it this way. He said, the world we live in, this is a direct quote, the world we live in is an honorable world. To refuse this deepest aspect of our being, to deny honor where honor is due, is to place ourselves on a head-on collision course with the ultimate forces of the universe. He said, this question of honor is the single most important question we need to deal with. He said, it's ultimately not a political, economic, or even an environmental issue. It's ultimately a question of honor. Only the sense of the violated honor of Earth and the need to restore that honor will awaken in humans the passion and energy needed to co-create a just and healthy future. Gregory Bateson, oh, by the way, Thomas Berry called himself a geologian. He was a Catholic priest, right? But he called himself a geologian, not a theologian, a geologian. But Gregory Bateson was one of the most significant thinkers of the last 100 years, and he said it even more powerfully. He said, if you imagine God as only outside nature, and you have the sense that you are created in the image of God, you'll naturally see yourself as above and outside the things around you. And as you unrightfully claim all mind to yourself, you'll see the world around you as mindless and therefore not entitled to moral or ethical consideration. He said, the world will seem to be yours to exploit. He said, this is your estimate of your relationship to nature, and you have an advanced technology, your likelihood of survival will be that of a snowball in hell. You will die either of the toxic byproducts of your own hate, or simply from overpopulation and overgrazing. The world is not a complex clock, and God is not so trivial as a clockmaker outside. One of my intellectual mentors in seminary was Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein talked about language games. He was probably the most famous philosopher of the 20th century. But he loved to piss off other philosophers and theologians because what he basically said was that virtually all theological and philosophical problems are caused because we don't understand the way language works. For example, these words and these concepts didn't even exist for the Hebrews. Life, time, wind, breath, reality, nature, climate, universe, and environment. None of these words existed, and none of these concepts existed. In fact, the Hebrew word for time was the same as distance. Now clearly what we mean by these words existed for the Hebrews. The Hebrew word for wind and breath was the Spirit of God, Ruach Adonai, Ruach Elohim. In other words, they had a personal I-thou relationship with what we call the wind and what we call the breath. And you know something? You didn't need to believe in the Spirit of God. You could not experience the Spirit of God. If you're breathing, you're experiencing the Spirit of God. And you know the only time you don't experience the Spirit is when you die. The breath leaves you. Now, all of these would have been interpreted. Whatever the climate was doing was interpreted. Whatever the environment was doing was interpreted. And for the Hebrews, it was interpreted as Yahweh. This is the Lord God. This slide is the heart of what I want to talk about this evening. And I'm noticing some of you are standing. There's plenty of chairs up here and some on this side if you want to sit. So, this is the difference between fictional and factual understandings of any divine, any entity, any god, any goddess from any culture Whether you're talking polytheism or monotheism, pick any one, and there's a difference between a fictional or unnatural and a factual or undeniable way. For example, and here's where I'm going to repeat myself because I said a little bit of this on Sunday morning. Poseidon was not the god of the oceans. Poseidon was not the spirit of the oceans. Anthropology has taken us down a dead-end path. Poseidon was a personification of the incomprehensibly powerful and capricious seas. Now, I know you don't get a chance to experience the seas a whole lot in this part of the world, but if you're on either coast, right, you don't need to believe in Poseidon. It was a personification of that reality. Eros was not the god of love or lust or the spirit of love or lust. Eros was a personification of what we today call love or lust. Gaia was a personification of earth, not the goddess of the earth, not the spirit of the earth. It was a female personification of earth. And you know the reason that the ancients said that the gods were immortal? Whoops. Is because humans are born and humans die. Humans come and humans go. Lust is always there. Poseidon is always there. Gaia is always there. Helios, this big ball of flame and light that gives us light, is always there. And you didn't find atheists back then saying, I don't believe in Helios. Well, whatever you're talking, this is what I'm talking about. Right? It's undeniably real. But if you think of Helios as a spiritual entity separate from the sun, well, that's believable or not. And don't take my word on it, please. Google any of these terms. Anthropomorphism, deities, personification, gods, goddesses personified. In fact, you can put in Google gods, goddesses personified and put Aztec or Chinese or Rome or Greece or India, and you'll find dozens of web pages of all the gods and goddesses from that culture and what they personify, both our inner reality and our outer reality. This is known in the scholarly world. It's just not known by people in the pews. And notice the radical difference between believing in Gaia and honoring Gaia. Between worshiping Poseidon and respecting Poseidon. This is a profound difference. This is what Wittgenstein was getting at. We stumble over language. And this book was written only 20 years ago, Faces in the Clouds by Stuart Guthrie. It's now the foundation of an entire research. There's like 150 scholars all over the world working in the field of evolutionary religious studies. Hindu scholars, Buddhist scholars, Christian scholars, atheist scholars, who are all trying to understand, through a whole different range of sciences, understanding religion. And nobody, even the evangelicals, don't debate the centrality of personification for understanding myths and religions. There's just too much evidence. It's compelling. See, a factual view of God transcends belief or disbelief. It doesn't matter whether we believe in a reality or not. Reality is something that every plant, every animal, and every human being cannot not experience, inwardly and outwardly. That's why I love this quote from Philip K. Dick. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And as an evolutionary theologian, that's what I'm pointing to when I use the word God. When I use the word God, and when all of us who are coming from an evolutionary theology, or what I'm calling religion 3.0, when we use the word God, we're not talking about some supernatural being that you can either believe in or not. We're talking about an inescapable reality that whether you believe in it or not is still real. In fact, I would switch. As best I can tell, there are at least three things, or maybe more, but there are at least three things that are real whether we believe in them or not. Time is real, nature is real, and mystery. Not just the realm that we don't know, but the entire realm that we don't even know that we don't know. So any God that is less real than a personification of time, nature, and mystery fails the Anselm test. You could say the God test. Because a God that is a personification, let's put it this way, any God who merely transcends nature is less real than a God who transcends and includes nature. Any God who only transcends time is less real than a God that transcends and includes time. St. Anselm, by the way, was a bishop in the 11th century. And he said basically, if you define God as the greatest being who can possibly be imagined, And that being only exists in your imagination, then a greater being can be imagined, namely one that exists in reality. Thomas Aquinas was one of the Christian church's greatest theologians. He said a mistake about creation will necessarily result in a mistake about God. Now, if that's true, what it means is the more we learn about the nature of the universe, the more we learn about the nature of creation, if we're not updating what we mean when we even use the word God, we may have definitions and understandings of God that are so outdated they're no longer life-giving. Every characteristic that we attribute to the divine derives from our experience of nature. If we imagine God as beautiful, gracious, loving, awesome, powerful, majestic, or faithful, it is because we have known or experienced beauty, grace, love, awe, power, majesty, or trustworthiness in the world. If we lived on the moon, and that's all we and our ancestors had ever known, all of our concepts and experience of the divine would reflect the barrenness of the lunar landscape. This is obvious when we think about it. We're so used to thinking in these terms. Okay, I'm going to use both religious language and secular language. I'm going to use both mythic language and literal language, and you're going to see both are legitimate. You can't understand how God or reality created complex life if you don't understand extinctions. You can't understand how reality or God created healthy soil or lakes in the northern part of the world if you don't understand glaciers. You can't understand how God or reality created the periodic table of elements or planets or life or even the atoms of your body if you don't understand red giants and supernova explosions. Watch this photo very carefully. You surely can't understand how God or reality created continents and oceans and mountains if you don't understand plate tectonics. Folks, we don't believe that the Atlantic Ocean is growing at the same rate our fingernails grow. We know it. We got the satellites to measure. We know exactly how fast the Atlantic Ocean is growing and how fast the Pacific Ocean is shrinking. And we've only known about this for 200 years, this for 170 years, this for 75 years, this for 65 years. This has all been revealed. None of the biblical writers knew any of this stuff. This has been revealed through evidence. Evidence is how God or reality is speaking to humanity today. Evidence should be considered modern-day scripture. It's our main source of divine guidance today. Scientific evidence, historic evidence, and cross-cultural evidence. And the evidence of our subjective experience as well. Any time, any culture, any tradition in the world says God said this or God did that, what follows is always an interpretive personification. We know of no counterexamples in the history of humanity. It's only our inability to read mythic literature that's made us blind and deaf to what God has been revealing for centuries. I mean, you open up the Bible and you find, it says, "Thus saith the Lord," and you've got 2 paragraphs. And it sounds like, if you just take it literally, that somebody was there with a tape recorder catching some voice booming from the sky. But it wasn't that. If you could go back in time, like with a TV crew, to record the moment of divine revelation, you'd find some old guy sitting at a desk, either penning himself or dictating to a scribe how he saw what was real, what he saw was emerging, and then speaking a word of warning to the people that what basically, folks, we need to get right with God, or else if we don't align with reality, we will perish. This is the fundamental stance of a prophet. Get right with reality or else. But we're not going to be present to who are the prophets alive today if we think that all the prophets lived 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. God is a mythic or sacred or I-thou name for reality or nature as it truly is. Remember, the words reality and nature didn't exist in the Hebrews. A meaningful interpretation, centered on the way God is reality personalized, not a person. In fact, all gods and goddesses are personifications, not persons. Now, please, no whining at this point. Because often theists start whining in one way and atheists start whining in the exact opposite way. Theists often will whine at this point and say, well, wait a second. Are you saying that my God is only a personification? Well, no, not exactly, because whatever reality is in its essence is always going to transcend anything we can know, think, or say. But anything we try to say or think about reality, yes, that's a personification. But atheists start whining and say, well, wait a second, if this is true, then my argument that God doesn't exist evaporates. Well, yeah, that is true. But as long as there are theists who believe, when they use the word God, they're thinking of a supernatural being who blesses some and smites others, you're probably going to find atheists who say there ain't no such thing. And again, don't take my word on it. Please Google any of these terms, read this book, Google this term here. There's lots. In fact, there's a book that just came out about a year ago called Big Gods. That's a fabulous overview of this entire field. The only reason we don't sell it out there with the others is because it's a textbook and it's really expensive. I think one of the great insanities of today is the theism versus atheism debate. Because you've got tens of thousands of people that are debating on whether or not God exists, when the one real God, reality personified, we've been out of right relationship to, and we're now about to experience the consequences that are of biblical proportion. And yet you got so many people's energy tied up on whether God exists or not. It's insane. I call it collective insanity. Now, evangelicals will often talk about, do you have a personal relationship to God? Well, I suggest that if we don't have an honorable relationship to time, an honorable relationship to nature, and an honorable relationship to mystery, we don't have a personal relationship to God no matter what our beliefs may be. And what I mean by a dishonorable relationship to time is if you think time only goes back a few thousand years, or if you think, who cares about what the world's going to be like 1,000 years from now because Jesus is coming back, so, who cares? That's a dishonorable relationship to time. A dishonorable relationship to nature is when we think that we can continue to use the air, the water, the soil as a garbage can and destroy other species just for our benefit. And a dishonorable relationship to mystery is if you think your tradition has all the right answers to everything. Can I get a Darwin? Darwin! Yeah, amen. Kind of evolutionary amen. So these two questions, coming back to these two questions, what's real, or how things are, and what's important, or which things matter. Religion 1.0 is the authority of elders for 99% of human history before we had writing, because humans have been around for, Homo habilis, walking upright using stone tools for about 2 million years. We've had symbolic language for at least 250,000 years, yet we've only had writing for 5,000. So for like 98, 99% of human history, where you went to for your best understanding of these questions was the minds of the elders and what had been embodied in the rituals and rites of passage. Then we start writing down our sacred stories about what's real and what's important. So we find religion 2.0 is the authority of Scripture, the authority of the sacred texts. And again, you find different sacred texts in different traditions, but it's the sacred texts that really matter. Well, religion 3.0 is the authority of evidence, the authority of global collective intelligence. And see, each of these is collective intelligence. The collective intelligence of elders. The collective intelligence of the groups of men, at least in the Western tradition, the groups of men in the 4th century who had to decide which books were in and which books were not. I mean, the Roman emperor got all these bishops together, put them in a room, and basically said, you don't come out until you come up with, a way to unite your tradition. Because there was all kinds of chaos. He had all these scared bishops that were trying to decide which of all these epistles and gospels and letters were considered authoritative. It was their collective intelligence. But now we have global collective intelligence, which again, doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to value the wisdom of elders. It doesn't mean we shouldn't value the wisdom of Scripture, but we're lifting up the wisdom of scientific evidence globally. In fact, Thomas Berry said there's 4 wisdom traditions that we need to pay attention to. One is the wisdom traditions of the classical religious civilizations. The other is the wisdom traditions of indigenous peoples, tribal peoples, native peoples. The third is the wisdom tradition of women. Women don't think the same way as men, and we men need to learn. And that's why Connie and I both believe that we need a whole lot more postmenopausal women in leadership. No criticism, Mary. And we need the wisdom of science, the The wisdom of women, the wisdom of indigenous cultures, the wisdom of the classical religious traditions, and the wisdom of science. We need all of them working together. Now there's a cause, there's suffering that has resulted. Now again, if you're a humanist or an atheist, you may not experience this as suffering, but if you're a religious person, this is painful, some of this stuff. Youth are abandoning their parents' faith in record numbers. 1,200 people a day in America leave the church and don't come back. And most of them are young people, and when you ask them why, the vast majority, one of the top reasons is the conflict with science. The new atheists are mocking religion, and they're doing so by promoting Bible study. I'll say more about that in a minute. The highest rates of teen pregnancy, alcoholism, spouse abuse, and porn addiction are in the most Bible-believing parts of the United States. And evangelicals are being left behind. Evangelicals are in denial of factual revelation regarding big history. This is a poll that just came out 3 months ago. 77% of evangelicals deny a 13.8 billion year universe. 76% deny evolution. And 58% of evangelicals, that's a huge voting bloc, deny the reality of climate change. So that's what I want to shift to now. I want to talk about climate. I believe that climate change is the greatest moral issue in human history. Now, this is not to lessen the importance of other significant moral issues. I mean, slavery was a huge moral issue. The oppression of women was a huge moral issue. And there are many. But if we didn't deal with slavery at the time, we could deal with it the next generation or the next generation. We don't have multiple generations to deal with climate. And Connie and I had our climate change come to Jesus moment about 1.5 years ago when we watched David Roberts' TEDx talk called Climate Change is Simple. And so Connie edited down, the whole talk is 15 minutes. She edited down a 7-minute version I'm going to share with you here in a minute. But I want to pass a couple of clipboards because Connie and I, about 4 times a year, once every 3 months or so, we put out an email newsletter. It's called the Evolutionary Times. It's usually just a few paragraphs, but it's all the new things that have been added to our website, other things that are happening in this movement. And so I'm going to circulate a couple of clipboards. You don't even have to put your name because I don't enter in your name. All I enter in is your email address. But if you don't have good writing, like if it's not legible, then go ahead and put your name or put your email address twice, or let the person next to you put it in. Because I was entering some of these today. About 10% of them I can't make out. People have such bad writing. So you'll never get more than 1 email a month. In fact, it'll usually be a lot less than that. So let's take a look at the 7-minute video called Climate Change is Simple by David Roberts.
Everything we have built, we have done in this period of relative climate stability. So what we've been doing for the last couple of 100 years is digging up carbon out of the earth and throwing it up into the atmosphere and changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere, like has happened in the past, except for way faster. In geological time, the blink of an eye, we are substantially changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere, and all of climate science has been about what's going to happen, what's the Earth going to do in response to this. And so we've already seen that the process is underway. We have measured, we have witnessed, observed with our eyes and our thermometers about a 0.8 degree Celsius rise in global average temperature since before the industrial age, since before we started digging all this carbon up. And this may not seem like a lot, less than 1 degree Celsius. But the thing to know about it is these greenhouse gases we throw up stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. There are very long time lags involved here. So this 0.8 degree temperature rise is a response to what we were doing 50 to 100 years ago. And what we see in the first half of this century will be a response to what we've done the last 50 years. And what we see in the latter half of this century will be a response to decisions we make today. So the question is, temperature is rising. How high does it have to rise before we need to worry, before we're in danger, before bad things start happening? The typical answer to this question has been 2 degrees Celsius. So obviously, what counts as not dangerous versus dangerous is not a hard scientific question. It's a political question, and this was a political decision to take this 2C number, mainly made by European climate negotiators well over 10 years ago. James Hansen is the climate scientist most famously known for raising these warnings, but it's a growing scientific consensus that 2 degrees is in fact dangerously high. Which is bad because we are almost certainly going to blow past 2 degrees Celsius. There's some reason to believe, a recent study said that even if we stopped our climate emissions tomorrow, we're still going to get more than 3 degrees this century just from momentum from the previous emissions. But stopping at 2 degrees now would take a level of global coordination and ambition that is nowhere in evidence. So, a lot of climate scientists don't really want to tell you this because they don't want to depress you, but I'm just a blogger, so I'm happy to depress you. 2 degrees Celsius is probably off the table. So then the question becomes, well, what does it look like if temperature was higher than that? What would, say, 4 degrees Celsius look like? Oddly, there hadn't really been a lot of concerted scientific attention to that question because climate scientists honestly thought we wouldn't do that to ourselves. But we are doing it to ourselves. So in 2009, several climate change research groups in England drew together a group of scientists, commissioned some papers, and had them really take a hard look for the first time. What would 4 degrees Celsius look like? There were a lot of papers, a lot of equations, a lot of talk and complexity. I have helpfully paraphrased it here for you to make it easier to grasp. 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise would look ugly. Among other things, that would be the hottest the Earth has been in 30 million years. Sea levels would rise at least 3 to 6 feet, and this excludes some really tail end possibilities, but 3 to 6 feet at least. And persistent drought would cover about 40% of the currently occupied land on Earth, which would wreak havoc on agriculture in East Asia, in Africa, South America, Western US. All this combined would produce hundreds of millions of people who had been driven from their homes, either by their cities being swamped by sea level rise, or by hunger, or by all the attendant ills that come along with those things. And to boot, probably somewhere around half of the known species on Earth would go extinct. The really dangerous possibility is that what are called, the Earth has several of what are called positive feedback systems. So for instance, in Siberia, there's this permanent ice, the permafrost, and it contains a bunch of methane in it. As it melts, it releases that methane. The methane causes more warming, which melts more ice, which releases more methane. It's a self-sustaining process. Or sea ice melts. Ice is white, reflects energy. When it melts, it becomes dark blue and absorbs more energy, which heats the oceans, which melts more ice, which creates more dark surfaces. You see, there's a number of these systems that are self-perpetuating. The danger, the great danger of climate change that towers above all these other more specific dangers is that these positive feedback systems will take on a momentum of their own that becomes unstoppable. Human beings will lose any ability to control it at all, even if we stop all our climate emissions on a dime. So this is what I mean by climate change being simple. There are many complicated and fascinating discussions to be had about what to do about it, or about what effect our actions might have on the climate and when, or which policies are best based on cost-benefit analysis. There's complexity, plenty of complexity for those of you who like complexity. But we now know, to a fair degree of certainty, that if we keep doing what we're now doing, we will face unthinkable catastrophe. That's the bumper sticker, that's the take-home message. And that, saying, I don't want to talk about that because I don't know the ins and outs, is like saying, I don't want to raise alarms about Hitler's army being 100 miles out because I don't know the thread count of their uniforms, or I don't know the average calorie intake of a German soldier. You don't need to know those things to be scared that the army's on the march and to raise alarms about it. Similarly, if we keep doing what we're now doing, we are screwed. This we know now. To stabilize temperature, and I don't mean stabilize temperature at 2 degrees, or 4 degrees, or 6 degrees. I mean to ever have a hope of ever again having a stable temperature of any kind. Global climate change emissions need to peak, stop growing, peak, and start falling rapidly in the next 5 to 10 years. Every year we do not get started on this, we add, according to the International Energy Agency, an extra $500 billion with a B dollars to the price tag of what it's going to cost us to do this eventually. Every year we wait, that's $500 billion down the drain. Now, you and I look around at current politics, particularly US politics, and massive, coordinated, intelligent, ambitious action does not strike us as particularly plausible. In fact, it might strike us as impossible, but that is where we are, stuck between the impossible and the unthinkable. So your job, anyone who hears this, for the rest of your life, your job is to make the impossible possible.
Connie and I have been aware of climate and global warming for decades, but it went from the back burner to the front burner in a major way when we watched this. The largest and most prestigious science body in the world, the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, just came out just about 3 months ago with a very uncharacteristically prophetic What We Know campaign. One of the things that they said was that 97% over this period here, 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real, humans are the main cause, and we must take immediate action to avoid condemning our grandchildren to a literal hell on earth. And that was that period. This 1 year period here, November 2012 to December 2013, we're talking about 99.9% of the scientists in agreement. Now, why is it that when you poll Americans, 40% of Americans think that the scientific community is divided on this issue? Well, yes, it's certain media outlets for sure, but also this book here, Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. The same scientists, and in many cases the same PR companies, that confused the issue successfully for 50 years. We now know beyond any shadow of a doubt, we have internal documents, that the tobacco industry knew in 1962 that smoking caused cancer and a whole bunch of other problems. And yet they successfully confused the issue for 50 years to avoid certain political changes that would not be in their financial self-interest. Well, we don't have 50 years on climate. I call this the modern face of evil today. And when I use the word evil, just to be clear, anything, when we pursue our own self-interest at the expense of future generations, if that's not evil, what is? And this book here, Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, by Kathleen D. Moore. There's like 60 essays from many world leaders on how this is the most important moral issue in the world. Either one of these books or both of them will ignite a righteous fire, I promise. Now, watch here. This is just the last 62 years. And notice how the Arctic is warming twice as fast. 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2012. That's the last 62 years. It's now picking up steam. I consider Bill McKibben a modern-day prophet. He says it's simple math. We can burn less than 565 more gigatons of carbon dioxide and stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Anything more than that risks catastrophe for life on Earth. The only problem? Fossil fuel corporations now have 2,795 gigatons in their reserves, 5 times the safe amount, and they're planning to burn it all, unless we rise up to stop them. Trust me, it is not in the business plan of the coal, oil, and gas industry to leave 80% of their assets stranded in the ground. And this book here is one of the best books on climate change. Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H. The reason he spells it differently is because what he claims, and it's true, no matter how fast we change things, the world we will live in for the next 10,000 years will be nothing like the world we lived in the last 10,000. He's ultimately got some pretty hopeful stuff. It's going to be really good for us. James Hansen is another modern day prophet. One of the most respected scientists in the world is consistently getting arrested. And when I say consistently, I mean he's regularly getting arrested here. Like, look at this, he's got a smile on his face. He knows these guys now. Now, why would one of the most esteemed scientists in the world repeatedly get arrested? Well, he himself says why. He says it's his grandchildren, and this is another one of the best books on climate change, Storms of My Grandchildren, the truth about the coming climate catastrophe and our last chance to save humanity. In fact, here he is for about 45 seconds with Amy Goodman, talking about why this civil resistance.
These protests are what we call civil resistance, in the same way that Gandhi did. We're trying to draw attention to the injustice, because this is really analogous. This is a moral issue, analogous to that faced by Lincoln with slavery or by Churchill with Nazism. Because what we have here is a tremendous case of intergenerational injustice, because we are causing the problem, but our children and grandchildren are going to suffer the consequences. And our parents didn't know that they were causing a problem for future generations, but we do. The science has become very clear, and we're going to have to move to a clean energy future, and we could do that. And there would be many other advantages of doing it. Why don't we do it? Because of the special interests and because of the role of money in Washington.
That's why campaign finance reform is so important. So what I'm calling the evidential Reformation, I'm suggesting this is going to make the Protestant Reformation look puny in comparison. And this basic understanding that reality is God, that facts are God's native tongue, and if we don't come into right relationship with God, reality, nature soon, we are condemning our children and grandchildren to a literal hell on earth. Now, obviously, when people learn about this, as I suspect most of you already were, the question, what can I do? What can we do? Is such a vital one. Well, we can all change light bulbs and drive less and fly less, and all that's important. And I encourage you to continue doing that. But I would say by far, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more important is to do the one systemic thing that we have to do. If we get this one right, almost everything else follows naturally. If we don't do this, everything else we do won't be enough. It's that important. We have to, it's sometimes called revenue neutral, carbon fee and dividend, otherwise simply known as carbon tax. We can no longer allow the free or subsidized polluting of the commons. It's that simple. And the organization, if you only remember one thing from my evening program, please go to Citizens Climate Lobby, join the local chapter. They are the most empowering organization around the whole world, not just in the United States, for how to work with your representatives and how to further this so that this becomes a reality. Because here's the thing, in the next 2 to 8 years, we will tax carbon, there's no question. But whether we wait 8 years to do it, or whether we do it in the next 2 or 3, just that difference will make the difference between the suffering of billions of humans and animals for thousands of years. It's that important. Because what this does is it marshals the entire power of the market globally to help us all move in the right direction. In fact, I mentioned, those of you that were at the climate rally just the other day, I mentioned one of my heroes is Bob Inglis, a Republican from South Carolina. He says it more succinctly than anybody I know. He says, I favor a conservative approach that marshals the power of the market and doesn't increase the size of government. Here it is in a nutshell. Put all the costs in all the fuels and eliminate all the subsidies. and then watch the free enterprise system solve the energy and climate problem. He just nails it. And everybody, Al Gore, Bill McKibben, literally all the major climate leaders are all saying this is the single most important thing we need to do. So again, Citizens Climate Lobby, Energy and Enterprise, but do join Citizens Climate Lobby, because here's the thing. When this happens, when we actually do this, you really want to be able to look a young person in the eyes and say, I helped make that happen. It'll be one of the proudest moments of your life. Here's a Christian theologian, actually he's a farmer, but he's a brilliant writer who really gets personification. Wendell Berry. He says, nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. So coming back to some of the suffering, some of the challenges for religious people at least, why is the most prosperous and Christian nation filled with genuinely good people betraying the future? Why is traditional religion shrinking in the West and secularism growing so rapidly? I mean, look at here are all the mainline churches. This is the Catholic seminaries, but look at the Southern Baptists. It's not just the liberals. The Assemblies of God only expects 8% of their youth to stay in the church. Why are some of the new atheists excitedly promoting Bible study? I mean, P.Z. Myers, he's the most widely read science blogger in the world. 50,000 people a day read this guy's science blog. He's an out atheist. Here's a direct quote. He says, there's no sure way to make an atheist than to get them to actually read the Bible. How can you say that? Well, it's because what they're doing is that they're focusing on some of these absolutely gruesome passages, not just in the Old Testament, but also in the book of Revelation and elsewhere, that if you sum up the morality of the Old Testament, like in one sentence, you could sum it up as obey the Lord or die. In the New Testament, it's believe in Jesus or fry. And yet our own government defines terrorism this way. The U.S. Department of Defense defines terrorism as the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to inculcate fear, intended to coerce or intimidate others in the pursuit of goals that are generally religious, political, or ideological. Now the good news, if you're a religious person, is that God is not a cosmic terrorist. Why are rates of teen pregnancy, alcoholism, domestic violence, and porn addiction highest in the parts of America where the vast majority claim that they're saved from their sin? I did a TEDx talk 2 years ago called Why We Struggle and Suffer. And it was all because we struggle and suffer not because our great-great-great-great-great-grandmother ate an apple. It's because we have mismatched instincts and we live in a world of supernormal allurements. In fact, I had 3 evangelicals come up to me after my program, because this was delivered in Grand Rapids. And Grand Rapids, of course, is a pretty conservative part of the world. I had 3 evangelicals come up to me within a 2.5-hour period after my program, and all 3 of them said basically the same thing, which was, I was a young earth creationist until I heard you talk. Now I've got to accept evolution, I've just got to do it in a God-honoring way. In fact, one young man, he's probably 20, 25 years old, he said, I used to think that evolution was about Darwin, DNA, and dinosaurs. I didn't know it was about how to have healthier relationships, how to live a more Christ-like life. And then why have biblical literalists been on the wrong side of history regarding most factual and moral issues over the past 500 years? I suggest to you that all 5 of these questions can be answered by the same cartoon. Onward, steed, in search of truth. Bible tucked under the elbow, going the wrong way. That's why I encourage every minister, every priest, every rabbi, every imam to subscribe to Science News and meet with the scientists and the humanists of your congregation and get them to help you interpret the science in ways that inspire your congregation. I promise, young people will find the church relevant again. And in fact, and many religious people don't like this guy, but I got to tell you, Richard Dawkins' book, The Magic of Reality, is an absolute gem. I recommend it to all adult study groups. In fact, even teenagers. The book was written for 12-year-olds and above. It was originally written as a children's book. Had pictures and stuff. This is a version that doesn't have the pictures, but it's very easily to read. I highly recommend that book. See, a factual view of God in Revelation calls forth boldly pro-science, prophetic speech. And who have been the prophets so many times in the past? Well, our poets often are. Our artists are so often prophets. So I want to share a 2-minute poem from one of my dearest friends in this movement, Drew Dillinger. I've known him for 20 years. And here's a 2-minute poem of his called Hieroglyphic Stairway.
This poem is called Hieroglyphic Stairway. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, as the mammals, reptiles, birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? I'm riding home on the Coma train. I've got the voice of the Milky Way in my dreams. I have teams of scientists feeding me data daily, and pleading I immediately turned it into poetry. I want just this consciousness reached by people in range of secret frequencies contained in my speech. I am the desirous earth, equidistant to the underworld and the flesh of the stars. I am everything already lost. The moment the universe turns transparent and all the light shoots through the cosmos, I use words to instigate silence. I'm a hieroglyphic stairway in a buried Mayan city, suddenly exposed by a hurricane. A satellite circling Earth, finding dinosaur bones in the Gobi Desert. I am telescopes that see back in time. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I can't sleep because my great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the earth was unraveling? I want just this consciousness reached by people in range of secret frequencies contained in my speech.
So everything I've said up till now is tame compared to what I'm about to say. I believe that we are in for, and this age will be known as the Great Reckoning, where humanity, we have been out of right relationship to reality, and we're now about to experience the consequences of that. And it's not because some supernatural being outside the universe is pissed off at us and going to punish us. It's because we've been out of right relationship to reality, and there's a cost to that, there's a consequence of that. But I think it's also going to be known as the Great Homecoming. The prodigal species. We've squandered our inheritance. We're waking up in the pig pen, as it were, to our predicament, and hopefully we're coming back home to reality, to God. Obsolete and impotent notions of God and God's Word are killing us, shrinking the church, destroying the world, and condemning our children and grandchildren to hell on earth. Just when religion's moral guidance and righteous reverence for life has been most needed, it's been most absent. Why? Because the church has been blind and deaf to what God has been revealing for centuries, largely because of what I call the triple idolatries: idolatry of the written word, idolatry of the otherworldly, and idolatry of beliefs. And remember the quote that I began with? Thomas Berry, what I'm calling blind and deaf, Thomas Berry called spiritual autism. Now, I need to make sure I'm not misunderstood. By idolatry, I don't mean anything so goofy and trivial as bowing down to statues. I'm talking about when we make as our ultimate commitment, our primary concern, something that doesn't deserve to be, or that betrays and defiles the future. Idolatry of the written word is when you think God's best guidance, that is our best map of reality, is frozen in time in the distant past. Idolatry of the otherworldly is where you think where ultimate value, ultimate reality, ultimate love exists is only outside time and nature. And idolatry of beliefs is when you think any one belief system is the only one right way to right relationship to reality. Good people are dangerous, and great people can engage in great evil when their map of reality is outdated or when they privilege ancient mythic texts over current evidential revelation. I mean, imagine that you're trying to go, right, from Davenport to Portland, Oregon, and you haven't updated your GPS in your car since 1840. You've got a map of the Oregon Trail in there. Now, how successful do you think you're going to be trying to get to Portland? You're not going to get there. You're going to drive in a river somewhere, right? Tens of millions of Americans have an outdated map of reality. Their map of reality is 2,000 or 3,000 years old. So their understanding of what's important is skewed. Did you know that the last Gallup poll that I saw said 41% of Americans believe that these are the end times anyway, so why bother? Is there any wonder why there's not a commitment among evangelicals to ensure a just and healthy future if you believe the end of the world's going to happen? And here's the thing. Every culture since Jesus has believed that theirs was the last, or among the last. And what we can be sure of is that they die, and then their kids believe that. And they die, and then their kids believe that. I believe it's both legitimate and, in fact, necessary for religious people like me to begin saying, what's God saying to us today? And I'm not channeling an otherworldly entity, and I'm not predicting the future. I'm saying if we give reality a voice, what is reality telling us today? Well, here are some things. You check it with your own experience if you think that this is what God is saying to us. Facts are my native tongue. Honor evidence as Scripture. Repent of your idolatries or face hell and high water. I preached a sermon at one of the largest Unitarian churches in the country, just outside of Denver, Jefferson Unitarian, and the title of the sermon was God Rebukes the Religious Right. Repent or face hell and high water. I got a standing ovation, which didn't surprise me at a Unitarian church, but I preached that same sermon, God Rebukes the Religious Right, repent or face hell and high water, at a Baptist church in Houston, Texas, and they gave me a standing ovation. I burst into tears. I did not expect that at all. Nature is my secular name. Obey my laws or perish. Abandon apocalyptic thinking. It is an abomination. This book right here, John Michael Greer, is literally my favorite author in the whole world. I've read 8 of his books in the last year and a half. Every Wednesday I read his blog post, because he writes a blog post every Wednesday, John Michael Greer. But this book here, Apocalypse Not, everything you know about 2012, Nostradamus, and the rapture is wrong. It's the 3,200-year history of end times thinking. And he shows the tragedy and the suffering that has resulted because of people who believe that the end of the world is going to happen. And not just religious people. This has also happened in secular circles. Purge plutocracy. That is where money rules government. Purge plutocracy and end corporate personhood. And stop polluting the commons. Tax carbon now. I think God, I think reality, when we give reality a voice, when we listen, what is reality telling us? This is what reality. Maybe many other things, but at least this. And again, here are the websites that I mentioned before. citizensclimatelobby.org, energyandenterprise.com, and carbontax.org. Now, I could spend an entire evening, and I'm not going to, I'm going to spend about 30 seconds, but talking about what is the gospel, the good news according to science around a lot of these things. I can say the good news about climate in 5 words. We can see it coming. We can see it coming. Never before in the history of not just our species, never before in the history of the planet has any species been able to see a potential extinction level event coming in time to, ward off the worst and to prepare for what's already baked into the system. That's really good news. So I want to leave on a positive note. No matter what has given your life meaning, tens of thousands of things will give your life meaning, but the final meaning of your life is your legacy. And so when we have in mind the fact that countless past generations struggled, you have ancestors that struggled and suffered and sacrificed. And if they hadn't sacrificed, you wouldn't even be alive. All of us have ancestors like that. In fact, I'm doing this interview series that'll be on a Skype interview series called The Future is Calling Us to Greatness, where I'm interviewing literally the top people in the world on climate change and sustainability and peak oil. All the top, the most esteemed leaders. And I interviewed Nikki Silvestri. She's the executive director of Green for All. That's the organization that Van Jones started. She's an African-American woman. And I asked her, I said, Nikki, how do you wake up each morning inspired to be in action in the face of some really scary stuff? And she said, I meditate and I commune with my ancestors. And I said, what? And she said, I know a little bit. I've asked a lot of stories. It's been passed down. For example, my great-great-grandmother was repeatedly raped and had her children taken from her. And yet she didn't commit suicide. She kept going. And I'm a direct descendant. And then she told me some other stories, and I was in tears. I was blown away. But we all have ancestors that sacrificed. So when we hold that in our hearts, we then realize how is the past rooting for us? And in a way that the future is also calling us to greatness. I keep a picture of Isla Renee, my granddaughter, right by my computer. She is the embodiment of the future calling me to greatness. Because as I shared during the climate rally the other day, good, bad, great, and evil have always, in all cultures, been defined by how we impact others and how that ripples out to the future. If I do something kind or generous to you, or to the future, if I am helpful to the future, I've done a good thing. If I harm others or harm the future, I've done a bad thing. If I sacrifice in order to be a blessing to others of the future, I've done a great thing or heroic thing. But if I self-centeredly serve my own needs, screw others, to hell with the future, I've done an evil thing. This is not moral rocket science. We don't need 10 commandments to tell us this. Carl Sagan said it very powerfully. He said, how is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, subtler, more elegant. God must be even greater than we dreamed. A religion old or new that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, he suggests, such a religion will emerge. Now, I believe he was correct in the intuition, but wrong in the detail. Because such a religion isn't emerging, not a religion like other religions. Such a religious orientation that unites tens of millions of us has been emerging for decades. A worldwide meta-religious movement has been emerging for decades, largely unnoticed, at the nexus, at the intersection of science, inspiration, and sustainability. Beliefs are secondary. What unites us is a pool of common values, priorities, and commitments regarding, one, living in the right relationship to reality, and two, working together in the service of a just and healthy future for all. And I'm not the only one saying radical stuff like this. Paul Hawken, in his New York Times best-selling book, Blessed Unrest, How the Largest Social Movement in the History is Restoring Grace, Justice, and Beauty to the World. I like the title of this, the subtitle of the hardcover even better. How the largest movement in the world came into being and why no one saw it coming. So the book that I'm working on right now, I'm tentatively titled Religion 3.0, Factual Faith and the Fate of Humanity. And these are the 6 main points that I think unite tens of millions of us around the world. Reality is our God. Evidence is our scripture. Big history is our creation story. Ecology is our theology. Integrity is our salvation. And ensuring a just and healthy future is our mission. Now, if you're a conservative religious person, you might say it a little differently. You might say, God must include reality. Scripture must include evidence. Genesis must include big history, and so on. Or if you're a secular person, you might not like the religious language, so you might say it like this. Reality is my ultimate commitment. Evidence is the main way reality is revealing itself to me, and that sort of thing. In fact, I did a God in Big History. If you just put into Google God in Big History, you'll get my YouTube videos that I go into much greater depth and all that. No matter what our attempts to inform, it is our ability to inspire that will turn the tides. Now, I'm almost 6'1". I'm 6 foot and about ½ inch. These guys are tall. The guy on the left is John Mather. He's NASA's senior astrophysicist. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in physics. The guy on the right is Craig Mello. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in medicine and physiology. The reason that they invited me to the Library of Congress is they both had read my book, and they were doing a program together there called The Origins and Evolution of Life in the Universe. And Craig sent me an email. He said, Michael, you got to come to the Library of Congress and get your picture taken with us. He said, it'll be great for your book. You bet I went. Here's what they said about my book. John Mather said, the universe took 13.7 billion years to produce this amazing book. I hardly recommend it. Folks, as an author, it just don't get any better than that. Craig Mello said, the science versus religion debate is over. Must read for all, including scientists. Now, although this never did get me on Oprah, I thought this was going to get me on Oprah, right? I did meet with the vice president and the executive producer of the Oprah Network about the possibility of creating a show called Soulful Science. So we'll see. But we did create an 80-second book trailer I wanted to share with you. Thanks. When my book went to print, we had 5 Nobel laureates. About 3 years ago, Charles Towns, he's now 98. He was 95 at the time. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1964 for the invention of a laser. He calls me on my cell phone. I don't even know how I got the number. He says, I finally got around to reading your book. He said, I love it. So we've got 6 now. So y'all have heard an awful lot from me. I'd love to hear any questions that you might have, and especially I'd also love to hear what, if anything, did you find helpful, interesting, or inspiring, or what did you find particularly difficult or challenging? Yeah.
I was intrigued by your, I guess, paradigm of the 3 different levels of worldviews, where you talk about the wisdom of the elders, the wisdom of Scripture, and the wisdom of science.
Yeah.
I have a pretty decent science background, but I'm not a practicing scientist right now. And so I get most of my science information either from listening to people talking about it or from reading it. So in a sense, I'm going back to the wisdom of the elders and the wisdom of a form of Scripture in order to get my information about science.
Yeah, I think I differ with you on that, because there's a difference between, yes, you're getting wisdom from those who are distilling, like in Science News, for example, who decides, the editors, but that's not the same as the wisdom of elders. What you've got is a worldwide community. See, this is the thing. This is where religion can really learn from science, is that science is self-correcting. Scientists are just as prone to error as anybody else. In fact, scientists have just as much self-deceptive instincts as anybody else. But the scientific community as a whole is geared to try to prove each other wrong. There's incentives to try to prove each other wrong. So there's a corrective built in the system, and that's what we religious people need to also, I think, embrace.
Because I think it's easy to fall into the trap, though, of seeing science as a belief system.
Yeah, but that's exactly what it's not, though. Science is an evidential system that weeds out ideas. If they don't pass the test of time and they don't pass the critique of multiple attempts to show it wrong, then it just doesn't last. Because there are things that we thought were true 50 years ago, or 80 years ago, or 100 years ago, that clearly have proven not to be. So there's, again, that self-correcting thing. But you're right. What I appreciate about your comment is that this is not scientism. This is not saying science provides everything, because we need the humanities, we need the arts. There's still a place for personal experience, I call myself an evidential mystic. Yeah. Actually, wait a second, somebody was, yeah.
So we share something in that my mother also watches Fox News. So all the time. She also drives a Prius with the Sarah Palin sticker on it, so. But how do you suggest that we approach people, especially, most of us probably know someone intimately who doesn't believe in this? Like my mom's like, oh, it's so cold, it's global cooling, you know, she generally does not believe, and most of my family does not believe in global warming. What is your suggestion?
Well, the first thing I would suggest, the question is, how do we relate to people who don't get it, people who, are in denial? First of all, denial is a normal, natural, and rather healthy mechanism. When we can't see a way forward, we usually are in denial. And so one of the reasons why Connie and I sell some of the books that we do is because it's not just like the scary stuff, but how to hold the scary stuff in ways that are inspiring. Fortunately, there's a growing number. For example, just 4 or 5 days ago, I interviewed Katharine Hayhoe. If any of you saw the Years of Living Dangerously, she was the rock star. She was this young evangelical woman who is profoundly affecting evangelicalism on climate change, because she's a climate scientist. And she's also the most skilled person talking about it. So I would say if you get any of your family to watch any of her videos, Katharine Hayhoe, first of all, she's a Republican. Her husband is a megachurch pastor, an evangelical megachurch pastor. She's got all the right creds. And yet she is like wickedly effective. She's amazing. I love this woman, Katharine Hayhoe. And there's others too. Bob Inglis, the Republican from South Carolina. So there are people that can reach some of our conservative family members and friends in ways that maybe some of us aren't going to be able to.
Can you spell that, Hayhoe?
Hayhoe. Katharine Hayhoe.
Is she from Texas?
She's from Lubbock, Texas, correct?
Awesome.
Earlier you used the term personification, and I don't think I quite got what you were...
Yeah, personification, what I'm suggesting is the single most important scientific discovery about religion is that our brains are inherently relational. And the main way our brains instinctually relate is that we sort of unconsciously filter for the things that are most important for us to filter, which is human agents, human beings. So we naturally, that's why his book was called Faces in the Clouds. We see faces, we do this inherently, and we do it throughout every discipline, every area. And all the gods and goddesses, if we think of the gods and goddesses, I mean, this is the genius of Hebrew, of the monotheistic tradition, was basically saying that there's not the God of the sun and the God of the this and the God of the that. There's one God. The problem is, since we've had a mechanistic worldview, we've thought of that one God in such trivial ways as an otherworldly being that now we relate to nature only as an it to be exploited or used. And that's why this perspective is going to kill us. So I'm not suggesting that we have to personify in the way the ancients did. But I will suggest this: there is nothing more juicy and yummy and fun. Connie and I personify North America as Nora. So we've got this female name, Nora, that we say we're falling ever more in love with Nora because we've been traveling Nora for 12 years. So we've got this personal I-thou relationship with Nora. We personify what most people call the sun. We call Great Soul, S-O-L. And we sing to Great Soul in the morning. We sing to Great Soul, bye-bye, Great Soul. Now we know that the sun doesn't have a consciousness like me and you, yet we have this honorable relationship. It's an I-thou relationship. But we've done the same thing with Angel, our van. Our van is Angel, The GPS is the voice of Angel. We also personify our relationship. And any of you who are couples here, if you have a spouse or a partner, pay attention to what I'm about to say. This is the most important tool we've ever used. We personify our relationship. So there's Michael, there's Connie, and then there's Jasmine. And Jasmine is the mythic personification that we've given for us, or for we. And sometimes it's really clear what Michael wants to do, and it's clear what Connie wants to do. But when one of us asks, what does Jasmine want? It allows me as a man to not be attached to my position, and I can actually go with something that Connie might have suggested in the first place, but I don't feel like she's won and I've lost. I feel like I'm proud. I'm doing what's good for Jasmine. Now, why it is that Jasmine usually wants to do what Connie wanted to do in the first place, I haven't figured that out. A happy wife is a happy life, as they say.
So how do you recommend we combat the argument that economic killer, or job killer, economy killer?
Again, these people like Catherine Hayhoe and Bob Inglis are strong, conservative, both religiously and politically, and they destroy those arguments. And they're far more credible with your conservative friends and families and neighbors. So I'd say just let them do it. I mean, I've got some good stuff out there on one of my DVDs and on the thumb drive, but again, I'm more sort of radical. You know, I don't watch Fox News every day. I don't watch it all. In fact, I don't watch any television. Yeah. Stand up, exactly. In fact, any of you who are from the Great March for Climate Action, please stand up.
We're walking every day to do this. And I want you to hear that with your own eyes, we have seen what the fossil fuel industry is doing. They are getting that stuff out of the ground as fast as they can. We walked through California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, following railroad tracks, double tracks, and every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, trains with 125 coal cars past us. The empty one's going this way, the full one's going this way. To go to someplace in another state, a power plant, or wherever they were going. Folks, we gotta stop it. That's killing us. CCL, I'm a member of CCL in Iowa City.
That's Citizens Climate Lobby.
You know, we're just ordinary people doing this walk across the country thing. I'm a retired psychotherapist. I'm 71 years old. We've got students, we've got retired school teachers, we've got engineers, we've got people who work in restaurants, everybody. And we're doing this because we're so passionate, like Michael is.
Connie and I actually, we so were inspired by the commitment of these marchers that we lined up 100 speaking engagements lined up between Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., and we're teaching and preaching along that route, and sometimes we're a week or two ahead of the marchers, sometimes we're a week or two behind them. Occasionally I'm able to show up on rest days and massage their feet or calves, because I'm telling you, these people are suffering. You know, this is a major commitment that so many of these marchers are doing. And in fact, if you want to support the march, either financially or any other ways, how can people do that?
ClimateMarch.org.
ClimateMarch.org.
You can join.
Yes.
And you don't have to join all the way to Washington, D.C., although that'd be awesome.
Yeah, actually, I think it's like $20 or $25 a day you can march, and that's
It's less.
It's less than.
It's however much you can.
Okay.
We don't want money to be else.
Because a lot of people can take off a week and they can march across their state or some part of their state. My daughter's going to be doing that. She's going to be marching. My 24-year-old daughter's going to be doing that, marching across part of Ohio. And so, plug in any way you can.
And I mean, I highly encourage you all, if you're able, to interrupt whatever it is that you have going on, because nothing that we have going on is relevant if we don't have it for it to happen on, or food to eat, or way to survive. I'm thinking a year of college for the march, but I'm going to go to the best college, but I want it has to be the rest of my life growing up. My practice and life back, I said, because otherwise nothing else can exist. Nothing else that we care about, our kids, our jobs, nothing.
This march is one way of doing something. It's my antidote to despair and hopelessness, and it's a heck of a journey, let me tell you. But you do it your way. Just do it.
If you do what your inner soul is telling you to do, you'll probably never be so happy as you have your life. That's what I've heard.
They're great people too.
And that's how I feel.
creation story more wondrous than that of a living self forged from the residue of an exploded star? Tell me a story of transformation more magical than that of a fish hauling out onto land and becoming amphibian, or that of a reptile taking to the air and becoming bird, or that of a mammal slipping back into the sea and becoming whale. Surely, this science-based culture of all cultures can find meaning and cause for celebration in its very own cosmic creation story. Do you know where I found that quote? 17 years ago, it was on the cover of the UU World, the national membership magazine of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and I was so blown away and impressed with that quote, I decided to track down and marry the author. And that's a true story. Now, I've already mentioned some pretty scary books, right? Some scary stuff. Here's how to hold that scary stuff in ways that are deeply inspiring. I cannot recommend these 4 books too highly. The great work by Thomas Berry, Our Way into the Future. Thomas Berry was one of the great leaders of the last century. He died just a few years ago, and this is in the top 10 books I've ever read in my life. Joanna Macy is still another great mentor of mine. Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. The Ecotechnic Future. I mentioned that John Michael Greer was my favorite author in the world. This is my favorite book of his. And Tom Atlee, Reflections on Evolutionary Activism. Essays, poems, and prayers from an emerging field of sacred social change. If you want to explore this kind of a sacred way of thinking about evolution more deeply, and especially if you want to share this perspective with others very inexpensively, what we most recommend are our DVDs. We say freely burn as many copies of our DVDs as you want. Each of these is 3.5 to 4 hours of our best programs. And we actually have the covers up on the website. So if you have a color printer, you can print off the covers and make exact replicas very, very inexpensively. And I'm looking around and I'm noticing this isn't a real young audience. So I'm going to say something just in case it's not obvious. This does not mean put them in a fire. It means make copies. I actually, believe it or not, about 6 months ago, I had a woman in her 70s. She came up to me afterwards. She said, I was glad you said that. I didn't know why we were supposed to burn them. And 11 hours, most of the best stuff of our DVDs, in fact, almost all of the best stuff from our DVDs is on this 11 hours of videos on this one little thumb drive. And a lot of people don't know how to make copies of DVDs, but anybody can loan somebody a thumb drive, have them just drag and drop the stuff to their computer, and then loan it to somebody else. It's a great way to share this stuff with your friends and neighbors and relatives very, very inexpensively. Now, the first 2 hours of this is a program that I delivered in Colorado Springs, Colorado, to a group of Christians on Tuesday night, and I gave the exact same program to a group of atheists and humanists on Wednesday night. And both groups loved the program, and I find that encouraging. In fact, one of the young women on Tuesday night said, I see how this could give me a more intimate personal relationship to God than ever before. And one of the curmudgeonly atheists the next night said, finally a God that makes sense and one I can respect. I find this encouraging. The second 2 hours of this, though, is a program that I delivered with high school girls at a Catholic Girls Academy. And I just spent 2 hours answering their questions. And they asked some really conservative questions. So if you have any conservative Christians in your family or friends, or if you're a conservative Christian, I highly recommend this. It's also on the thumb drive. Now, the main stuff that Connie and I have been doing for the last 3.5 years is on this DVD here. The main program that I delivered for the last 3.5 years is this one, Inspiring Naturalism. I actually delivered that at a church in Omaha, Nebraska, and they had 3 TV cameras, and we got a great recording of it. All the material that I did in my TEDx talk is also on that DVD. Because why we struggle and suffer, as I said before, isn't because our great-great-grandmother ate an apple. It's because we have mismatched instincts, and we live in a world of supernormal allurements. We interviewed my son on internet gaming addiction, and this is a really amazing thing because he had an evolutionary understanding. That's how he got out of this gaming. The Chinese government says that the greatest threat to their entire nation is that they've got an entire generation of young people addicted to internet gaming. It's huge. This is something we don't talk about in the church a whole lot, evolution and infidelity. We can talk about it because what this does is this removes the shame and blame. It makes it understandable. And if you are a woman, or if you have to relate to women, modern women with Stone Age instincts. Connie does this. This is a program Connie does, and it's fabulous. So I highly recommend it. And again, all this stuff is also on the thumb drive. Now, most of this DVD is Connie, but we actually, I just remembered now, we actually, my car's in the shop, and all the copies of this are not, but the one program that we do have that's also on the thumb drive is this one right here, Death Through Deep Time Eyes. I think that's Connie's greatest legacy. I think what she will remember for 200 years from now is this death material. Because what she does is she takes a look at the gifts of chaos and death in an evolving cosmos. This is what reality, or God, has been revealing through evidence. We now know that mountains die, continents die, oceans die. The Apostle Paul didn't know that. Moses didn't know that. Muhammad didn't know that. Without the death of species, there'd be no complex life. Without the death of fetal cells in the embryonic stage of development, we'd all be spheres. The reason we have shape is because cells died here, 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 and here. Without the death of plants and animals, there would be no food. I mean, this is obvious when we think about it, but we're not used to thinking about death having a positive role. Without the death of stars, there would be no periodic table of elements, no planets, no life. Without the death of elders, there would be no room for children. I mean, think about it. In a finite world, if all you have is birth with no death, very quickly you're wall-to-wall people, wall-to-wall skunks, wall-to-wall bacteria 60 feet deep. It doesn't take long. Death is essential on a finite planet. And so what we now know, we don't believe this, we know this. This is not religious beliefs, this is religious knowledge. That death is natural and necessary at every level of reality, and thus death is no less sacred than life. And this isn't something abstract. This was me 4 years ago. I went through a very serious bout of cancer. I had a tumor the size of my fist in my spleen. And I went through 6 rounds of chemotherapy and had my spleen removed. And even when we were looking at the possibility that I could die in the next 6 months, and there was a short period where we thought that that was the case, I had what religious people call a peace that passes understanding. And it wasn't because I was holding out hope for pearly gates when I died. I'm a religious naturalist. It seems to me pretty obvious where we go to when we die is the same place we came from before we were born. And whether you speak of that as coming from God and returning to God, or coming from nothing and returning to nothing, or coming from mystery and returning to mystery, I think all those are legitimate ways of talking about it. But as I sometimes say, not just jokingly, I mean it, that if where I go to when I die isn't the very same place that all other plants and animals and bacteria have gone, I'm going to be pissed. And I am eternally grateful that reality, whether you use secular or religious names to talk about it, gave me this experience. Because this is my granddaughter at the age of 16 hours on my chest, wrapped up in a baby wrap. The highlights of my life. So again, all of that's on this thumb drive. We don't have any more of these right now. And then finally, the main program that I delivered, that's the most popular program I've actually ever delivered, is called Beyond Sustainability, an inspiring vision of the next 250 years. And the reason that we picked 250 years is quite simple. If you compress the history of the universe into 100 years, like if you make 13.8 billion years equals 100 years, at that time scale, every minute is 250 years. So think about it. If we've got 100 years of trends to study, there ought to be a few things we can say about what the next minute might be like. And it's actually quite hopeful. These aren't the challenges that we might have to deal with. We're going to have to deal with these things. And then what are the things that we may or may not have to deal with, but by God, if we've got to deal with any of these things, they're going to be huge. We're already starting to see some of this. This is nuclear, biological, and chemical, or genetic, nanotechnology, or robotic, error, or terror. So this is the scary stuff. I don't leave people here. But I want people to have authentic hope. And we're not going to have authentic hope if we're in denial about what we're definitely going to have to deal with or what we might have to deal with. But then I say, okay, what are the long-term and the short-term positive trends that we can bank on? We can trust that these trends are going to continue. In fact, some of these trends have existed longer than humans have ever been around. And then finally, What's the likely good news? I'm not talking about crossing our fingers and toes and praying that Jesus, the cosmic janitor, is going to come and clean up the mess we made. I'm saying what's likely in the next 250 years, given current trends. And again, this is very hopeful stuff. And all of that's on the first 2 hours of this DVD, also on the thumb drive. And then finally, the 4 great gifts. I spent a half hour on each of these gifts. How this perspective reconciles science and religion. How it transforms our views of chaos. How it evokes inspiring, empowering visions of the future. And how it broadens our circles of care, compassion, and commitment. So if you get any of these, please do make copies. But again, most of the best content is also on the thumb drive. All the Evolutionize Your Life stuff, all of our new stuff on climate and ecology. This is not on any of the DVDs. And then the Evolutionary Christianity stuff, also Neil deGrasse Tyson. We've got an incredible thing that Connie edited, where he's saying some of the same things that we're saying. And New Hampshire Public Television did a documentary, a 30-minute documentary on me that was so blown away. I was in tears at the end of it. I was so pleased with how well they did. And then all of Connie's death material. So we're always looking for writing retreats. So if you have a second home or vacation home, or you go off to Australia once a year and you wouldn't mind us house sitting, please let me know. We love this part of the world. And we do all of our evening programs free of charge, but we also have a donation basket out there because this allows us to also do free programs in schools. I want to conclude with a guided meditation. And those of you that were here on Sunday, this is similar. But I want to just invite you, and actually, I want to lead into it with a quote. This is going to take maybe 3 minutes. And this quote is from Terry Tempest Williams. The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. They are kneeling with hands clasped, that we might act with restraint, that we might leave room for the life that is destined to come. So either with your eyes open or your eyes closed, I invite you to just pay attention to your breathing and to also pay attention to your body, just resting comfortably there in the chair. And then I invite you to just imagine that you're turning to the past and allow some ancestor of yours. It can be an ancestor you know about, or just imagining some ancestor that sacrificed in a major way, and had they not sacrificed and struggled and suffered, you wouldn't even be alive. Allow that ancestor to speak some encouraging word to you, and I'll be silent for about 20 seconds. And then thank that being in whatever way feels appropriate. That's what I mean when I talk about the past is rooting for us. Our ancestors are rooting for us. Now I invite you to turn to the future again in your imagination and allow some being 100 years from now or further out. It can be a direct descendant of yours if you have kids or grandkids, or just anybody who's alive 100 years from now or further out. Allow that person, that being, to communicate something that would inspire you to be heroic, to be of service to the future. And again, I'll be silent for about 20 seconds. and then thank that being in whatever way feels most appropriate. This notion of the past rooting for us and the future calling us to greatness. I invite you to ponder that this week, journal on it, meditate on it. And in some way, I invite you to make a commitment of one thing that you'll do this week. Just one thing that your ancestor would be proud of, and that future person would also be just moved to tears with gratitude. And then when you're ready, if you have your eyes shut, go ahead and open up your eyes. Come back to this place. The past is rooting for us, and the future is calling us to greatness. Obviously, this is mythic. This is not literal. But I suggest that this is one of the most useful and inspiring ways that we can think. I want to give Carl Sagan the final word. Those of you that were here on Sunday know that I consider this one line a piece of scripture. Science is at least in part informed worship. Science is at least in part informed worship. Thank you. Thank you. Again, Citizens Climate Lobby, the Great March for Climate Action, those are two things you can do. All the copies of my book are already signed. Connie's out at the book table. But I'm also happy to personalize it for you if you want me to. So if you bring up a copy, I'll be happy to personalize it for you. And thank you for coming.